Ken Corla. Like others, I'd like to join in welcoming the Ukrainian ambassador to the Chamber. And Ken Corla, it strikes me tonight we're all speaking slightly at a remove. We're speaking based on facts and figures, based on reports in the media. But it's very clear that our ambassador has family and friends at home, as do all her team. And we have to really put them at the front of our minds. This isn't something that they're watching on CNN. This is people's lives, this is people's livelihoods. And kilometres away from their front door is 150,000 Russian troops who aren't there to keep the peace and who aren't certainly there for sightseeing. And their intentions were laid clear by President Putin earlier in the week in his Deputy Howland colourfully calls it illuminating speech. It was a damn straight frightening speech. It was a window into the mind of a brutal thug of a dictator that has run roughshod over his own country and his entire sphere of influence since he came to power, held power, put his proxy Medvedev, and absolutely disseminated so much disruption and aggression throughout our continent, harking back to the darkest days of the Cold War and the Soviet dictators that preceded him, because it is quite clear he doesn't see himself as some liberal Democrat. He doesn't see himself as president of an independent Russia. He sees himself as an extension of the very worst of the Soviet Empire. And I think the facts and the events of these past few days have brought that achingly clear to the entire world, if it wasn't achingly clear to so many people, particularly in Ukraine over the last decade, but across the world. And I welcome, Ken Corla, the sanctions announced by the European Union formalised today, but I do question, Minister, are they enough? There's an emergency European Council meeting tomorrow. Will there be another emergency European Council meeting next week? I fear that there may need to be, because whilst these sanctions are welcome, I don't know if they truly go far enough. I certainly do not think these sanctions alone, albeit tied with the welcome sanctions from governments in the US, from non-NATO or some non-EU NATO members, from the Australian government and the Japanese government, may go some way to potentially stalling the aggressive ambition of Vladimir Putin. I don't think alone will absolutely stop it. And I must join with Sinn Féin colleagues opposite in simply criticising the impotent response of the British government heretofore in relation to dealing with the Russian oligarchs who use the City of London as their plaything. I think it was quite telling that the British Prime Minister ran from the Chamber in Westminster yesterday rather than respond directly to the very clear question of the Welsh MP Chris Bryant in relation to the role of Roman Abramovich. The one question I would have for you, Minister, at this stage is in relation to the EU sanctions. Can you confirm that these sanctions will also be targeted at those banks operating in occupied South Ossetia, in Georgia, those banks that Russia is funding the proxy governments in Donetsk and Luhansk? Because at the end of the day, these sanctions, while welcome and targeted against regime leaders, against Russian banks, against members of the Duma, it has to be at all the actors who are quite clearly ensuring that chaos reigns in eastern Ukraine. So, Minister, in your reply, if you can confirm that, I'd welcome it. And could you also confirm that the next tranche of sanctions has already been prepared? Because one of the most welcome things that came out of yesterday's discussions was the belated announcement to the German government of the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 project. It will come at a hardship cost in terms of energy provision for Germany, for the wider European Union in due course, but it is absolutely vitally necessary. Minister, you yourself have mentioned other things such as the staging of the Champions League final in St. Petersburg and other diplomatic measures that will come down to the line. But I think we need to be quite firm about what are the very clear financial, political, travel sanctions that can still be deployed and I fear might yet need to be. I think we need to be quite clear, Ken Corla, that Ireland is right to be extremely worried. Ireland is right to be extremely worried about what's going on in eastern Ukraine, what's been going on in the Baltic states, fellow European Union members like Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, what's going on in Belarus, what's going on the borders of Poland, what has been going on in Kazakhstan, what continues to go on in Georgia and elsewhere. Because we aren't at a great distance. We're a 34-euro flight away from Kiev. This isn't the other side of the world. And the Russian sphere of influence absolutely stretches to our shores. Many people raised understandable concerns about Russian naval exercises off the coast of Ireland a number of weeks ago. But what are the other things that actually happened that we should be extremely concerned about? Special powers used by the government 2 years ago to halt construction at the Russian embassy in Rathgar. They weren't building a conservatory, Cairn. That was a very real issue. 2 Russian diplomats expelled from Ireland after the attacks in Salisbury in England. A terrorist attack on sovereign British soil. We see the cyber attack that crippled our health system in August. No doubt, if it wasn't the Russian state acting, it was non-state actors who have the protection of the Russian government. Russia Today employed 8 people in the state not so long ago. They were based out of the Digital Hub, an entity financed by the Irish government. We have skin in the game, Cairn. There's 150 Irish citizens in Ukraine. There are so many surrogates in Ukraine giving birth to Irish children. There are so many Irish prospective parents at their absolute wits' end. People who are prepared to travel to Poland and walk by foot into Ukraine to protect their children. People opposite admirably talk about neutrality, but there are times and there are occasions in the world when we have to realise that we cannot stand ourselves alone. And when I fundamentally welcome the comments from Sinn Féin deputies opposite in terms of their support of UN resolutions and sanctions, why did Sinn Féin MEPs abstain on votes countless times in the European Parliament that proposed sanctions against Russia after the invasion in 2014? Why is it that Sinn Féin sits in a European Parliament political group where we have Irish MEPs, not of your party, but within your grouping, going out and defending the thug that is Vladimir Putin? Don't lecture the government from a height. Don't lecture the state from a height. You have enough in this area. And welcoming the actions of the Chinese government when we think about the Uyghur people or what's going on in Hong Kong is certainly something I think I would call on Deputy Brady to reflect on. I heard what you said. I heard what you said, and I'm responding direct to your comments. And I think there are other deputies in this House. I didn't interrupt your speaking time, Deputy. And in my brief time remaining, there are other deputies in this House who have talked about building an anti-war coalition. Well, do you know what happens to anti-war protesters in the streets of Moscow? They get locked up and they're never heard from again. This utter fantasy land that we can grasp our hands and pretend that it doesn't involve us, and if we just keep our mind out of it and it's 2 equal aggressors. This is not about 2 equal aggressors. This nonsense about NATO expansion. Independent, sovereign states who spent the last decades with an aggressor to their east, sought European Union membership, sought NATO membership for protection. This wasn't some imperialist plot from Washington like certain deputies who weren't even in the chamber would let us believe. This was the desperate decisions of governments who are threatened, who are being threatened, and one of which that has been invaded mere kilometres away from our shores. We have to wake up, Cairn, to the reality. Having an alarm at home doesn't make you aggressive, doesn't make you militaristic. Protecting your family, protecting your citizens is a responsibility of all governments. You cannot hide behind a convenient fig leaf. We had a fundamental debate last week in the Chamber about the future of our own defence forces. I never want to see Irish members of defence forces being put in harm's way, but I do want to see them equipped, paid and protected to carry out their first and foremost duty to protect the state. And that is why our defence spending would increase. And this constant myth and reference to the desire for an EU army denigrates the debate when we're talking about fundamental security cooperation. Because it's Ukraine today, Cairn, but it'll be Estonia tomorrow. It'll be Lithuania already. It'll be Latvia. The Estonian people had their entire social welfare system shut down for 3 days in August due to cyber attacks that came from Russia. So I don't buy this line that we cannot cooperate, that we do not have a fundamental duty and responsibility as fellow European Union member states to cooperate with other like-minded countries. These are our allies. We are not alone in the world. Back to the situation at hand, Cairn, we are at an extremely perilous point. We are dealing with a country, let's put the numbers out on the table. Its population is the same size as Nigeria. Its economy is the same size as Italy. Its military is the same size, a little bit less than France. The difference is it's prepared to ruin its economy, it's prepared to jeopardise its population, and it's prepared to use its military. The Western world has a duty and a responsibility to act. There's 3 options on the table. The third option, I hope, will never come because the consequences are so grave. We need to see continuing expansive fundamental sanctions. We also need to see that continued diplomatic effort. But let's not be fools to who we're negotiating with. But we need to ensure that the broadening alliance of the EU, the US, Australia, Japan, non-EU, NATO member states, and any country who believes in democracy, the speech, if anyone hasn't seen it, by the Kenyan Foreign Minister at the UN Security Council, is something that we all should refer back to. Because there are dark days ahead, and if the worst case scenario does happen, it doesn't bear thinking. You're talking about a military escalation that hasn't been seen since the Balkan Wars, far greater than that possibly. We're going to see hordes of refugees flooding into the European Union, fleeing for their lives. Mass murder, mass devastation, energy stoppages, and the most worrying level of conflict that we will have seen in this century, and indeed probably for 75 years. This is a very sombre debate, Ken Corla. As I said at the outset, it's very easy for us to remove ourselves, to talk about the figures, to refer to the headlines and the highlights. And I'd like to conclude, we don't need to just show and talk about our sovereignty with the Ukrainian people. We need to show a level of empathy to Ukrainian people represented here by their ambassador, to her family members, to her friends, who tomorrow morning will wake up not knowing what Vladimir Putin has in his mind for them and their children. Gurmagat.